Okay, so I'm thinking to talk about Suspiria and the fairy tale element. This can be kind of the main film analysis part of the episode.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds great.
I think looking at Suspiria through Bettelheim probably a first, so it makes sense to put some of that analysis here. And even if I wasn't the first with Bettelheim, there are definitely going to be a lot of firsts as we go through this and get a little bit more deeply into things. So, well, just to preface this with one idea, Bettelheim sees the Snow White story as one of female development from child to adult. And that's kind of the way I'm going to frame Suspiria.
Ah, interesting. I feel like we're kind of I'm having flashbacks to The Shining where we were talking about Bettelheim and fairy tale.
Right. Well, one of the first things to notice in Suspiria is that all of the young women in the dance school are infantilized. One of the actually Argento's first he actually wanted to have like I think 8-year-old actresses at first. He went anywhere from like 8 to 12 years old. And one of the ways in which they're infantilized is that all of the doorknobs in the school are raised about a foot so that the girls have to lift their arms upward in order to open the doors.
That's a very interesting observation.
The same thing happens in Phenomena, and there's a even better symbol there. Her first meal at the school is her roommate gives her baby food.
Yeah, that's definitely a theme that's weaving through.
Right. So for most of the movie, Susie is sleepwalking. She's asleep because of the red wine that the witches give her. The red wine is a magic potion, just as the evil queen gives Snow White the poison apple. So you have red wine, red apple.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as you said that, I thought of the apple being red.
Right, right. And throughout Snow White, the apple is one of three temptations the evil queen gives in the original fairy tale, and all three of the temptations are red and play to their sexual symbols as well.
What are the other two?
Besides the apple, one is a corset, and I think either some makeup or something to make your hair pretty.
Okay, so I think you've made a pretty strong case for both infantilization and a parallel to Snow White. Wait, was it Snow White or Sleeping Beauty?
Yeah, Snow White. It's actually there's a Sleeping Beauty element to it in that she's asleep as well. But so when Susie finally has a kind of awakening, when she finally wakes up and she pours the red wine down the drain instead of drinking it, the red wine coats the sink like blood and it won't disappear.
Yeah, I noticed that. I was watching it with someone else, and she noticed that too. It's very striking.
I'm going to come back to that in a minute. After that, suddenly there are two weird red lights out a window, and she opens it to see what it is. And it's the eyes of a bat who comes in and attacks her. She kind of knocks it to the floor, and then it starts to crawl towards her, and she throws a white towel over it and beats it until blossoming red blood stain comes up through the middle of the white towel.
Ah, I see.
She's in the bathroom, of course, which is where a young girl usually discovers this. This is the menstruation symbolism. In The Delicate War, I write, the red wine blood that Susie pours in the white sink basin cannot be made to go away down the drain due to its persisting reality as a reminder from another world. It is the post-pubertal signpost of inevitable sexual maturity, and its fantasy quality marks it as a sublime object. Now, of course, the red stain appearing in the middle of the white towel is a continuation of the menstrual blood symbolism. And of course, in fairy tales, menstruation and defloration and pregnancy and childbirth are all kind of given under the same symbolism.
Yeah, this is holding together very nicely.
Does all that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay. And in the video I sent you, which is just a clip from this section, the way that the film goes is she looks down at the blood in the middle of the white towel, and then she leaves the bathroom. And then what does she do?
Smoke a cigarette.
Right? And that's a post-sexual activity.
Yes.
And so we go from like this infantilized girl to an asleep girl, and now to one who has awakened to sexual maturity. And, she smokes a cigarette as if she has become an adult. And this is the exact point where she decides to go into, to find the witch's like central location in the school and to go head to head against Marcos.
It's very compelling.
Right. So with the white towel, well, Snow White was born when the good queen pricks her finger while sewing, and 3 drops of blood fall on snow.
I also noticed a female character getting her finger pricked in Inferno.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's an interesting one because that's like, yeah, that's a prick to the finger. And then the woman who is kind of her doppelganger gets sliced from the broken doorknob.
The scene in the taxi, they really parallel each other. The two scenes with the girl in the taxi in both Suspiria and Inferno.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the same cab driver.
I had a feeling that was the case.
Okay, so there are a lot more parallels, but I'll leave a lot of those to the listener. In any case, as we go deeper and deeper into this, the subtext of the film is going to change until we're talking about Suspiria as an allegory on Nazism. But so far, we have the fairy tale developmental structure of a young girl reaching puberty or discovering sexuality. So she's going from a child to a teenager or a young woman. And with Otto Rank, fairy tales often deal with the major change from total dependence to independence that accompanies the development from child to adult. There's a quote, an interesting quote from Argento in a German interview where he stated that Suspiria is an important journey, a journey to gain knowledge and a journey to grow up. Susie basically becomes a woman during this experience, and that's why the movie ends with her laughing. I thought it was a journey for her to get to know herself.
Well, that certainly supports your interpretation. And I have to say, nothing that you've argued so far feels like a stretch.
Right. It's interesting. I mean, we discussed a little bit about how, you never really know what a thing is. And then to kind of find in this horror film that there's like all this depth to it, it's kind of surprising.
Well, going back to The Shining, someone who listened to our podcast on The Shining remarked that she felt the depth. I don't remember exactly, but in our exchange, it was like the depth was felt subconsciously.
Mm,
And I think that's why certain horror films really captivate us in a way
yeah,
and make us go back and watch them.
right,
It's almost like trying to understand a dream.
right. It's kind of funny and sad when I've read interviews with a lot of the actors and actresses that have been in Argento's films. They usually try to distance themselves from it and talk about it as if it was silly and that, they prefer more serious films. But like there's actually more depth in the Argento films than the other stuff that they've worked on.
Right. That is, I mean, and this is kind of a general sense that I've gotten. There's so much depth in so much Italian cinema in general.
Hmm.
It's almost like it's its own entity.
Yeah. So we have to ask about the teachers who are witches in Suspiria. In Snow White, it's the evil queen's mirror gazing narcissism, her jealousy at the budding beauty and sexual allure of Snow White that creates the main confrontation. In The Delicate War, I wrote that many parents wish to retain the image that the child has of the parent as sort of powerful or beautiful or whatever, and may attempt, as the queen does, to put a halt to the transition to stunt the child for vanity's sake. A child put in this position, blocked from reaching the next stage, often unfortunately regresses. Bettelheim explains that narcissistic parents are threatened by the child's growth. As long as the child is totally dependent, he remains, as it were, part of the parent. He does not threaten the parent's narcissism. In mother-daughter relations, this can often end up as a sexual rivalry, where the daughter struggles for the father's and other men's affections, and the mother fights against her waning attractiveness in the face of the daughter's increasing attractiveness and sexual awakening. Common motif in many fairy tales of children being swallowed by adults seems to speak to this battle. The idea of giving birth as the ultimate creative act gives this a new dimension. The dead womb, killing life instead of creating it, swallowing instead of freeing.
This reminds me of, uh, I don't remember who was speaking. It was in Inferno. The three mothers were described as actually being stepmothers and not really being mothers at all because they don't actually give life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's completely related. There are actually a number of fairy tale elements to Inferno as well. They definitely work as a pair of movies.
And while you were speaking, it was almost chilling because I had a thought that I'd like to share.
Sure.
This idea of a feeling of a threat to one's power and authority and infantilization,
Hmm.
it made me think of how governments sometimes function.
Yeah, absolutely. Argento himself originally saw the three mothers, who are the head witches of Suspiria, Inferno, and Mother of Tears, as symbols of corrupt political institutions that must be fought against. And he connected them to past violent political protests in Italy. And he talked about powerful liberation for a young person to assert himself against the institutions.
Yeah, there's a lot that can be mined from this. I'd like to discuss this further at another point because
Right.
I have a lot of thoughts that are arising in my mind.
Right. Yeah, we definitely wouldn't be going off track with a kind of global system interpretation or that sort of thing.
Right. Absolutely. And also Ken Wilber's idea that there's a confused notion about the nature of oppression.
Um,
There's a misinterpretation of people being oppressed when there's actually a hierarchy of development,
mm,
and that the idea that you're protecting someone from the hierarchy of development to defend them against oppression is completely misguided, because the only way for people to be set free is for them to become competent.
yeah, absolutely. That's a really great point. Yeah. So in Suspiria, the idea here is Susie's struggle towards independence against these pathological surrogate stepmothers in the form of witch teachers. It's the struggle of authority versus freedom, dependence versus kind of competence, like a self-reliance, predominance versus obeisance. And in Suspiria, the witches basically try to take her into their power structure to, of course, she would be at the bottom of that power structure. That's one of the things. And there are all kinds of interesting battles of wills between the teachers and Susie. One of the main ones, one that I found really interesting, is they keep trying to get her to sleep at the school, and she wants to go and have Olga as her roommate and live in an apartment. So that's a kind of infantilization and a way of kind of keeping her under their thumb. And like sleeping at a school is a very dependent position. But Susie fights well against them in that regard. But then they use some magic to get her to pass out. And then, like, they drug her at the school. And while she's out, they bring her suitcases from Olga's place so that she'll have to sleep at the school.
There's something that's related to that I'm interested in, and it also connects to other Argento movies, and that's when the maggots
Uh-huh.
are falling from the ceiling and the food was rotting.
Yeah.
Could you comment on that a little?
Yeah, I'm not 100% happy with sort of my understanding of what happened there, but in Inferno, it's made a little bit clearer that Varelli used sacred geometry to make the homes of the three mothers amplify their power. So the homes are extensions of the bodies of the head witch. So that means that the dance academy in Suspiria is an extension of the body of Helena Marcos. Yeah, it's made clear in Inferno where the witch can like automatically close doors that people are trying to, go through in the building and so on. But anyway, the maggots are found in the attic, so you could say that that's a symbol of the of Helena Marcos's head, that she has a twisted and sick mind.
Oh, that makes sense. Well, but I mean, one thing it reminds me of is the maggots and phenomena.
Right. Yeah. And those maggots are at the core or center of the house, where I think you can make a kind of similar interpretation about, the little boy's mother.
Is that the same actress as the woman in Inferno?
Yes. Also, you mentioned Sleeping Beauty, right? I forgot to mention back then. Bettelheim noted that many young women experience a state of focusing inward and being withdrawn and being sleepy in the lead up to their first period. So you have that sleep symbolism in Sleeping Beauty, in Snow White, and in Suspiria.
Well, okay, so there's a scene where she's walking down the hall and a woman flashes something in her face,
Hmm.
and it seems like it made her sleepy or somewhat hypnotized.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's what I mentioned earlier about when they were having the battle over where Susie was going to sleep. And, she won the sort of argument, and they let her stay with Olga, but then they put that sort of magic over her to bring her back to the school.
Oh, that's how the magic was applied with that
Yeah,
whatever the woman was holding.
right.
That makes sense.
So Daniel, he's in what I wrote in Delicate War is that he is in one of the most German sequences to ever appear in a film. And that's where he starts by taking in the most Bavarian of shows as men in lederhosen slap the Schuplattler on tables in a beer hall in the neighborhood of the Nazi Party national headquarters. The coincidence of all that should remind one of Hitler's beer hall putsch. Daniel with his dog, a German shepherd, wearing a red-white cross marking like a swastika, passes clopping Gestapo look-alike police who eye him up. He walks to a large square, Königsplatz Square, where Hitler held his rallies and parades and mesmerized the people with his speeches. Forces, as if from on high, swoop down from the Glyptotek like Hitler's voice or the ubiquitous power of the witches, and the dog is forced to kill his friend as violent military-like drumming plays. And I think that's a good segue to talk about Suspiria's connection to Nazism.
Yeah. I mean, that was a very disturbing scene.
Yeah.
And I have a thought that could relate to how you're going to connect this to Nazism
Uh-huh.
or authority in general. And that's the way that the dog, I mean, I like the way you put it. I mean, he was defending the loyalty of his dog.
Right.
And it's really horrifying to see the dog attack him.
Right.
And later, when she is in Helena Marcos's chamber
Hmm.
and the body of her dead friend is coming towards her,
Yeah.
it's a similar kind of feeling when she looks over and she sees the outline of the actual witch.
Hmm.
And it's as if she has that level of discernment to know this is where she actually is. This is where my enemy is.
Right. Well, absolutely. There's similar dynamic between those two scenes. And then part of Susie's progression is it's not just from child to adult, but from an inability to discern to an ability to discern. And one of the interesting things that I noticed in Helena Marcos's room is that there's an arrangement of items next to her bed that looks the same shape as her bed. And where Helena Marcos sits in the bed, if you look at the arrangement of items next to it, you see that where the witch is on the bedside, in this arrangement of objects, is the eye of discernment.
Ah,
I'm gonna have to put a screenshot up on Twitter for that one, but
yeah, that's what I was thinking.
right. In the book, I use Susie being mesmerized by the witch's power to segue to a discussion of propaganda, or how we are mesmerized by power and by authority, how propaganda is used to maintain that authority, to curtail freedom and force us to obey. I think this podcast will end up being like, 40 hours or something if we go too far into the propaganda element of it. But
It's something I want to do a separate podcast.
yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, I've been thinking about it. Definitely want to discuss Edward Bernays.
Right. Yeah, let's do that. And of course, I use Jacques Ellul's book Propaganda for the Suspiria chapter in the book. We can get into his thought. But okay, so skipping over the propaganda section, we go to the level where Suspiria is about Nazism itself. And in the book, I use Denis Villeneuve's 2013 movie Enemy as a lens through which to explore the Nazi elements in Suspiria.
Yeah, that was a quite interesting viewing experience watching Enemy. I mean, I think you and I had very similar experiences, which is when I was done watching Enemy,
Mm.
shortly after I was watching Enemy.
Yeah. And it's kind of funny with the doubling in the film.
Yeah, that you. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Once I saw the finale of Enemy, I just started the movie over again at the beginning.
Yeah, that was my yeah. Wait a second. And then that brought so many emotions. I I realized I had different emotions the second time at the end. So, would you like to describe film Enemy?
Yeah, it's one of those things. If you try to describe Enemy, I mean, it's about a guy who discovers his doppelganger, and their lives get kind of intertwined with one another. They try to sleep with each other's significant others, and so on. But their names are similar, and I think like the faces of their significant others are similar. It's like it makes it a kind of difficult film to describe. Yeah, I don't know. How far do you want to get into the plot of the movie?
Well, then, of course, one issue is that, spoiler alert, I guess. But I'm interested in specifically your reading of The Spider and
Right,
how that could connect to what we're talking about.
right. Well, I think we have to spoil the movie in order to talk about that. There's no getting around that. I'll leave the story specifics to anyone that wants to read the book or to watch Enemy or both. But yeah, to spoil the ending, Adam calls Helen's name and goes to look in the room that she is in. But instead of her, he finds a hippo-sized tarantula crouching back defensively against the wall. And then he sighs, and then the movie ends.
And you also have this quote from Adam Bell saying, "Control. It's all about control. Every dictatorship has one obsession, and that's it." So in ancient Rome, they gave the people bread and circuses. They kept the populace busy with entertainment. But other dictatorships use other strategies to control ideas, knowledge. How do they do that? Lower education. They limit culture, censor information. They censor any means of individual expression, and it's important to remember that this is a pattern that repeats itself throughout history.
I think maybe the best way is just for me to read the passage where I kind of piece together enemy.
Yeah, that would be fine. I think so. Just for, I agree.
Okay. So Adam slash Anthony's wife, Helen, got pregnant, forcing him to give up his dreams of acting, of becoming a star. He cheats on her and moves in with Mary. He hates his family and the fact Helen is pregnant but is racked by guilt. This isn't the first time he has ended up in a situation like this. His mother, who he avoids throughout the film because of what he might learn from her, is trying to help him realize the right thing to do would be to return to Helen, but his fantasies collide with this realization of the right thing to do. There's a car collision, which is the seam in the fabric of his reality where the repetition starts with kissing another woman. The collision is symbolic of a powerful inner conflict between desire and responsibility. Back with Helen, he finds an envelope including the key to a shadowy sex club, is tempted again, and the cycle repeats. Adam is trying and failing to find himself. He cannot recognize the unconscious repetitions in his life. He doesn't like movies, which is his fear of the unconscious. And so I'm going to just add in there that he avoids movies, just like how in the quote that you shared from the movie, he talks about dictatorships limiting culture and censoring information.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The way Bettelheim explains Freud's work is instructive. He sees it as a persuasive literature to engage in the spiritual journey of self-discovery towards greater self-awareness and to see how the soul could become aware of itself. But the journey is not easy. We must become acquainted with the lowest depth of the soul to explore whatever personal hell we may suffer from, so that we may no longer be enslaved without knowing it. So, looking a little bit beyond the plot of Enemy, Adam, the school teacher, sees himself in Anthony's movie, a meeting with himself he was trying to avoid. So, Adam, our school teacher, has a meeting with himself in the form of a doppelganger named Anthony. It was a meeting with himself he was trying to avoid. There are various repetitions in his life, including this desire to not meet himself. The pattern of dictators crazy for control over their people throughout history is also the pattern of Freudian repetition and the self. Throughout Enemy, there are spider-related images. A woman wears high heels with designs like spider eyes. Another woman's high heel crushes a spider. A giant spider makes its way through the city. A spider-headed woman walks down the hallway to the sex club. The city is depicted as a web, and a crack on the car windshield from a car accident of great meaning near the end of the film perfectly resembles a spider web. The spider's symbolism at this level is the web, the trap of the repetition he finds himself in, pulled by unconscious forces and conflicting drives. Well, to start to pull that back to Suspiria, Enemy was based on Jose Saramago's novel The Double, and in an earlier novel of his, Saramago compares the power wielded by a fascist dictatorship to a spiderweb. The black and red color theme in Suspiria connects to a similar view of spiders, which traditionally symbolize the dark side of the feminine. Then the pieces all fall into place upon reading Villeneuve himself discuss Adam's web of conflicting forces and drives in these terms. You have compulsions that you can't control coming from the subconscious. They are the dictator inside ourselves. So the Nazi dictatorship idea in Enemy is then a Freudian premise. Adam's repetitive infidelity and fantasies of being a star, a real man's man, etc., show that he is fully under the totalitarian rule of his own unconscious. He is stuck in a repetitive negative loop, and this is likened to being stuck in a dictator's web, which is the web of the unconscious. This symbolism is not unique to Saramago and Villeneuve. In Satoshi Kon's Paprika, when people are forced into an unconscious dream state, they start marching while doing the Nazi salute. There is a dictatorial nature to the unconscious, and precisely because it is unconscious, we bow, salute, and obey it. We can see an obvious interpretation of Suspiria along parallel lines. The witches are not a hidden and corrupt institution, but the hidden authoritarian forces of one's own corrupt mind.
This is a very, very powerful interpretation, especially now at this point in history when people are so strongly inclined to externalize everything and looking for scapegoats and looking for the boogeyman, because it involves not taking responsibility for yourself, and this refusal to look inward and have a meeting with yourself, which is characteristic of Adam.
Right. It's interesting also that there is another Satoshi Kon connection, and that is in Paprika as well, that this cop is afraid of watching films just like Adam in Enemy. And it's because he's hiding something from himself, and he thinks that it will be shown to him if he watches film. It's the same kind of idea of film as the unconscious.
Right. And cinema as the mirror of the soul.
One thing I can say about this idea of the witches as symbols of the hidden authoritarian forces of one's own corrupt mind is that one thing that's surprising, most of Argento's filmography, the kind of surface level, is basically about psychosexual murder. But when you actually start tallying the murders, you find that the vast majority of them are actually to avoid being found out. There might be one murder that happened because of some kind of psychosexual issue, but then there are 10 after that to stop from being found out. So, as I write in The Delicate War, the idea of the killer trying to stop from being found out is exactly what the witches in Suspiria do. They try to keep their secrecy through killing. This is precisely the idea of the maladaptive fighting we engage in to keep the unconscious unconscious. We must continue to not know ourselves.
Well, you know what this reminds me of?
What's that?
Interestingly enough, and I think you may have even mentioned this quote in The Delicate War, is a line from Macbeth quoted by Kierkegaard in The Sickness Unto Death. Bad things begun make strong themselves by ill.
Yeah, I think I might have quoted that in The Delicate War.
I think you might have. And it really struck me because what I was thinking about was when you're talking about the three mothers, it makes me think of the three fates.
Right.
Right, and then you also have that in Norse mythology, like Urther, Verdandi, and Skald. And what you're talking about to a certain degree with the fates is the weaving of your fate,
Yeah.
which is like the weaving of the web.
Yeah, exactly. One of the one of the characters in Suspiria, Susie's friend Sarah, says that the hunt for the teachers that they're going on by listening to their footsteps is like the thread of Ariad.
Yeah, I remember that now that you mention it.
So we discussed that very German sequence in the film leading up to Daniel, the blind piano man, being killed by his own dog, and immediately following that is a shot of Susie looking into a mirror in the shape of a swastika. So I think that gives us a kind of direct line, right? Where she's looking into the mirror, which is to be looking into herself. And in herself, she is finding the authoritarianism or the totalitarianism, the Nazism of the witches is also inside her.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wonder if you could also read it where obviously a reasonable interpretation is that the witches use some kind of magic to make the dog attack the blind man, but also the idea that, an individual is blind and he's being led around by his unconscious, which can actually attack him.
Yeah, absolutely. You could make that interpretation. Well, to finish the sort of film analysis for Suspiria, I'll just read one short passage from The Delicate War. Suspiria, then, appears to be using Nazism at two levels. There is the idea of growing up, becoming independent from authority, and fighting authority that wants to use you for evil purposes, and gaining self-direction and discernment. And there is the totalitarian subconscious pressure in each of us Susie, like all of us, is fighting a dual-level battle against the outer and inner totalitarians. And the two levels are in fact tied together, allowing us to see a link between, for example, the tyranny of the unconscious in murder and the fascist murder regime of Nazism. Susie's will and her fierce defense of her own willed decisions allows her to stand her ground on her own and win the battle of authority versus autonomy against the teachers, witches, mothers. If the witches act as the totalitarian institution of one's own mind that fights against all possibilities of self-transformation, then they are the policemen in Susie's head who she kills with a peacock feather. At a socio-political level, this is the power of the individual will over the violent lunacy of institutions and their brainwashed masses. At the level of development from childhood to adulthood, this can be explained perfectly by Nietzsche's three transformations of spirit. And that's the next section in The Delicate War. So do you want to just try to wing the outro and see what happens?
Yeah, I think winging the outro is a good idea.
We could say, if we were going to record an outro, then maybe we should say this and that.
Yeah, like you've been listening to Phenomenoumena with co-hosts Ray, I am he.
And Gino. Yeah, well, we could do it like that.
Yeah, and then we could direct them to all the places where the podcast would be found. Spotify, iTunes, wherever they are. And, check out our webpage, Phenomenoumena.com. What about using this? Can we use this?
Yeah, I think maybe we should use this.